Dhamma savana kalo ayan bandhanta. Dhamma savana kalo ayan bandhanta. Dhamma savana kalo ayan bandhanta. Today happens to be week 11 of our Sutta exploration series. And for today's Sutta, we'll be working with the Majjimanikai number 18, which is the Madhupiṇḍika Sutta. It's truly a gem of a sutta. It's a wonderful sutta. In English, it's the Honeyball Discourse. And in this sutta, we will become familiar with the term. We've seen it before, but this sutta is known to be the sutta for going into a deeper understanding of what this term means. And the term itself is papañca. Many commentators have described it, at least in English, we see it as mental proliferation, conceptual proliferation. And it's come up here in our own discussions several times in the past. So, but now this sutta is known for papañcas par excellence. So we'll go delving into it shortly. If you remember the Buddha's teachings to the Venerable Anuruddha from a few weeks ago in the Untitled Sutta, and in it we saw how Venerable Anuruddha had been contemplating the 7 great thoughts, or the 7 thoughts of a great person. And he had delineated in his mind while he was meditating, this path is for one who is who has a leaning towards a secluded lifestyle, for example. This is a path for someone with energy, etc. So he gets to only 7. And Lord Buddha was reading his mind from afar, and he appears in front of him and he says, "Wonderful, Anuruddha, wonderful. These are wonderful 7 qualities of a great person. However, you missed 1." And he says, this path is for one who lacks, who no longer has papañcas, meaning no more having the mental proliferations, the conceptual proliferations that go on in the mind. And in Pali, the term is nippapañca. Papañca, nippapañca. Ni would be the antonym prefix. So an arahant is someone who has nippapañca. So, and in this sutta we meet yet again, as we did last week, Venerable Mahākaccāna, who, if you recall, he was the foremost in expositing, in classifying, explaining some of the verses, utterances of Lord Buddha's. So, as we saw last time in the Mahākaccāna Bhante Sutta, how he, I won't say disentangled, but opened it up eloquently, beautifully. The ideal lover of solitude, those verses, as to what it means, as what the Lord Buddha meant before he went back to his kuti, to this group of bhikkhus who had come asking for the detailed explanation to this summary, brief summary. So, in addition to these two suttas, of course, Venerable Mahākaccāna is also, we encounter him in other suttas as well. So we see him in the Majjimanikai, as we've seen. We see him in the Anguttara Nikāya, and we also see him in the Samyutta Nikāya. And he has a uniquely consistent approach. His detailed explanations have a certain motif to them. And even though sometimes it might sound a little bit dry, but it's so exquisitely perfect. He does not waste any words, as it were. Every word is perfectly placed. He rarely uses any metaphors or analogies, or especially similes. The only simile that he uses typically is the simile of a man who goes searching for heartwood and ends up clipping away, trimming only the branches and thinking that's the heartwood. And in this example, he was simply, and we see this reoccurring several suttas, he's basically kind of like scolding the bhikkhus for coming to him rather than to go to the actual fountain of Dhamma, Lord Buddha, which is the heartwood. So that's the only simile that I've found that he uses. But other than that, I don't recall seeing any other. His words go straight to the heart of the Dhamma. And, you know, he was also, we have two very wise students, disciples of Lord Buddha. One, of course, was Venerable Sariputta, and the other was Venerable Mahākaccāna. Oftentimes they put on the same pedestal, sometimes, actually, I can't say oftentimes, because of their ability in delineating, in explaining in detail. However, with Venerable Sariputta, of course, he was only second to Lord Buddha in wisdom. He would simply get a single word or an entire paragraph, a statement of Lord Buddha, or a doctrine, a doctrinal principle, a concept of the Dhamma. And he would dismantle it. He would take it apart and he would go into deeper and deeper layers, using analogies, using metaphors, using similes, abundantly, generously. Whereas Venerable Mahākaccāna, as I said earlier, he just goes to the main, whatever the juiciest part of that verse is that Lord Buddha gave. And usually it takes the shape of the sixth sense basis with Venerable Mahākaccāna. And then, so he would start from what the current usual situation is of a putujjana, for example, an uninstructed, ordinary, average human being. And then he would take it to the level of a noble disciple who has mastered restraint of these six senses. So what it would take the person to what level, the ideal, in a sense, of a person who has now on their way to attaining or has already attained. So he does give almost like the before and after image of what the teaching entails that are found within those verses. So he was known to take the verses, usually verses from Lord Buddha or utterances from him that Lord Buddha might have left, usually, perhaps even intentionally, as a brief summary. So they're, you know, but he has a laser sharp accuracy in going to the very crux of the matter. So as we're going through the sutta, let's pay attention to what he's trying to say in that regard. He's very frugal with his words, but wisdom is there throughout. So let's begin. Again, this is the Madhupiṇḍika Sutta, Majjimanikai number 18, the Honeyball Discourse. I have personally heard this. At one time, the Blessed One was staying at Nigrodha's monastery in the Sakyan city of Kapilavatthu. Then the Blessed One put on his robes in the morning, and by taking along his bowl and outer robe, he walked into the city of Kapilavatthu for alms. After the meal and while returning from the alms round, he entered the great forest. And in reaching a young bilva tree, he sat under it, while resting his body, spending the day in meditation under its shade. A bilva tree is almost like a wild apple. I don't know if it's edible. I think it might be edible. So it was big enough to provide him with a shade. And the city of Kapilavatthu, even though it's not as the remnants of it, you have different structures that archaeologists have been, excavating. You have some areas of the city still around, but sometimes in reading suttas, we think that they're very close, but they're not. So there's a lot of walking involved. And it doesn't say what time of the year it was, but obviously it wasn't the rainy season, monsoon season, but still it would get hot. So going into the great forest is going to provide one with a good amount of shade. And the Buddha also was a big advocate, as we all know, of seclusion. So here would be a place for him to go and practice and rest his body a little bit before heading back in the evening to his monastery. Then the Sakyan Dandapani, having gone out, walking and wandering for exercise, also entered the great forest. And in approaching the young bilva tree where the Blessed One was seated, he exchanged greetings while standing there to one side, leaning on his walking stick. Dandapani said, well, here we have an arrogant Sakyan aristocrat, basically, named Dandapani, who's apparently been following the Blessed One. Because you're going into the great forest. It's not like there's a caravan of people going to the great forest. I mean, somebody must be very picky about, okay, that path, and specifically that bilva tree where Lord Buddha was sitting. So we can see that it's intentionally exercise or, whatever, even though suttas say he was walking around for exercise. So he must have followed him from Kapilavatthu, the city where Lord Buddha was doing his alms round. So he approaches the Blessed One and asks him what may be termed as, we'll find out, a deliberate and very bluntly discourteous demeanor. For example, he doesn't sit down. That's very rare that you see in a sutta where even if people went to see other notable students or people came from other sects visiting disciples, noble disciples of Lord Buddha, they would always exchange friendly greetings and then they would sit down to one side. So, for example, in the Vinaya, as bhikkhus, we cannot give Dhamma talks to someone if we're seated for them to be standing up. We can't give a Dhamma talk. Or if we're standing up and they're sitting down, there's another rule for that. We cannot do that. So there are these subtleties which also indicate the presence or lack of respect that needs to be there. So here we see that he is simply standing there on his golden stick. It was, just a wooden stick. With, I've heard that it has gold on it in it. Some people said it's actually made, because he was very rich, of pure gold. Now, interestingly enough, even devas that came to visit Lord Buddha or his noble disciples would never, ever just keep hovering. It's a sign of disrespect. They would touch the ground with their feet. Otherwise, it would be like showing off to a noble arahant. So they would do that even to arahants, let alone to the Buddha. So here we have this person who's showing a major sign of disrespect. Anyhow, a little bit about Dandapani. He was the uncle of Princess Yashodhara and her brother Devadatta. Devadatta was the bhikkhu who ended up trying to kill Lord Buddha several times. He conspired to replace him as the Lord of the Sangha. So he had fed lots and lots of lies and slander, basically, to Dandapani. Plus, here we see Dandapani also being upset at the fact that Lord Buddha, as Siddhartha Gautama, left his niece, a young woman, a newly, a mother, basically. And he went and became a sadhu or a bhikkhu. So there was all this thing behind his question, which we're going to see coming up. And a very provocative, cunningly devised, in fact, simple looking question that he's going to ask. So here it goes. Basically, he's eliciting an argument. What teaching does the recluse proclaim? What does he teach? Very blunt, rough at the edges. And here's the Blessed One's response. Friend, I proclaim such a teaching through which one does not end up in disputes with anyone in this world of devas, along with its manas, brahmanas, the community of recluses, Brahmins, the world with its leaders and its people. Such a teaching whereby no more perceptions press upon the Brahmin, who lives unyoked and free from sensuality, without experiencing any more confusion or worry, having rid oneself from craving for any kind of rebirth into any state of becoming. This, friend, is the teaching I proclaim. This is what I teach. As you gather, this is a pretty tightly packed, complete, impenetrable, as far as trying to find, holes in it to argue, given its legitimacy of what nobility is. And it definitely captures the essence of what the Dhamma is all about, but it's impenetrable, like it's perfect. And in giving his answer, we see also how, from the very beginning, Lord Buddha says, hey, I'm not interested in any disputes. In fact, my teaching advocates no disputing with anybody, with politicians, with leaders, with whoever's got the loudest voice today. None of that. So this kind of like throws Dandapani in a tailspin. And let's see. When this was said, the Sakyan Dandapani, I love this part, shook his head, stuck his tongue out, wagging it, while his forehead puckered in 3 lines. Dum, 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 3 lines. So he was like, what? What is this? There's a human element there. This is like almost 2,600 years ago. Someone who's so obnoxious, who's so full of himself, coming over to Lord Buddha, trying to start an argument, and he gets that, and he's like, That's not what I came here for. Almost very childish. Then he turned around and went away while leaning on his stick. Doesn't even, you know, exchange any like goodbyes or anything. Very rude. Turns his back, basically. That's another sign of disrespect. Then in the evening, the Blessed One, coming out of his seclusion, went to Nigroda's monastery and sat on the prepared seat and addressed the bhikkhus thus. So here he relates the whole thing, which I will skip. So basically he says, bhikkhus, this morning I put on my robes and by taking my alms bowl, whatever I just read. I'm just skipping because I already recorded this, as you know, this new translation I did last week, and it's on YouTube. So please feel free to listen to it as often as possible. The original, undiluted with my words, words of Lord Buddha, that is. So give it as many times a listen as possible. So meanwhile, the Sakya Dandapani, having gone out, he's continuing here, walking and wandering for exercise. So he asks me, what teaching does the recluse proclaim? What does he teach? And I replied, etc., etc. When this was said, and the Lord Buddha repeats basically, Dandapani shook his head, wagging his tongue side to side, etc. When this was said, one of the bhikkhus, so a certain bhikkhu said thus, but Bhante, what is the teaching spoken by the Blessed One, through which one does not end up in disputes with anyone in this world of devas, along with its maras, brahmas, the community of recluses, brahmins, the world with its leaders and its people? Such a teaching whereby no more perceptions press upon the Brahmin, who lives unyoked and free from sensuality, without experiencing any more confusion or worry, having rid oneself from craving for any kind of rebirth into any state of becoming. So even a bhikkhu doesn't get like, okay, so what is that teaching? Which is kind of like putting yourself on the spot, like you must have heard Lord Buddha's teaching. You didn't, just drop from Mars or something. And the Blessed One instructs, bhikkhu, whenever harassed by the mental proliferations, papañcas, whenever harassed by the mental proliferations that are caused by getting caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, if one does not welcome them, nor delight in them, nor grasp onto them, then this means one has removed the underlying tendency for lust, the underlying tendency for hatred, the underlying tendency for holding on to wrong views, the underlying tendency for doubt, the underlying tendency for conceit, the underlying tendency for the desire to be reborn, and the underlying tendency for delusion. This in itself puts an end to all disputes and the drive to resort to sticks and weapons, to taking sides, to quarreling, to fighting, to slandering, to all manners of accusations, to using vile language, and to the telling of lies. In this way, bhikkhu, all these evil and unwholesome situations cease for such a person without leaving any remainders behind. If you can just take this, you have the entirety of the Dhamma. Just write this down, print it somehow, record it somehow, and just replay it, and you have everything you need, in a sense. Because it's there, everything that we keep talking about. But of course, this is where papañcas get highlighted and how much they in fact harass. And that's the word that I wanted to use in translating. typically the word that in English that has been used to translate this sutta, and specifically this section of the sutta, has been besetting, beset a man, beset a person, which of course has the same nuance, feel for it, but harass captures the whole experience of what happens to the mind when in the clutches, the grasp of papañcas, that I wanted to also put here. This is what the Blessed One said, and having given his brief instruction, the Sugata rose from his seat and went into his kuti. Sugata is a name, another name, a title of Lord Buddha. When functioning blindly and being led by the five aggregates, we don't just grasp, we grab with the zero intention of letting go. So even though we call them grasping or clinging aggregates, but when we look at our attitude towards these aggregates, it's more of a grab, clenched fist. You know, baby hippo or a relatively young hippopotamus, has one of the strongest bites. It's about 2,000 pound PSI per square inch, 2,000 pounds of pressure. But that's nothing compared to a Nile crocodile, which has actually about 5,000 PSI pressure in a single bite. It bites and it doesn't relinquish, it doesn't let go. I have a feeling that our own grabbing of the aggregates is far stronger and intense than those two. And it gives us a sense of, well, this is me, this is namarupa, this is my mentality, materiality, these are my sankharas. This is what makes me me. And so long as we're not seeing this, we're basically caught in its clutches. And oftentimes we don't even, I'm pausing here for highlighting the grasping part, because it's crucial to understand. And I just mentioned the word, even though it's two words, namarupa, but they're seen as a single word, mentality, materiality. There's no hyphen in between, in essence. But what nama stands for, to clarify, sometimes the question arises as to, Bhante, what does namarupa really is? I get it. Sometimes it's name and form. What is name? Like, what are we talking about? The person's name? What is it? In a nutshell, nama stands for feeling, perception, intentionality, contact, and attention, these five. And rupa stands for the Chatu Mahabhutani. They are the four great elements and their constituent parts. In the suttas, we also see the seeds from both parents, as well as milk and gruel or rice. That's also part of the rupa. But what comes out of these is what we continuously are grabbing onto. So soon after the Blessed One had left, it occurred to those bhikkhus, friends, the Blessed One has now gone back to his kuti, but without giving us a detailed explanation of what he mentioned in brief to us. So they repeat exactly what the verse was. And I'm not going to repeat it here to save some time for us, for any questions. And perhaps it's worth to read it again. Why not? Bhikkhu, so they're reiterating what Lord Buddha said to each other. Bhikkhu, whenever harassed by the mental proliferations that are caused by getting caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, if one does not welcome them, nor delight in them, nor grasp onto them, then this means one has removed the underlying tendency for lust, the underlying tendency for hatred, the underlying tendency for holding on to wrong views, the underlying tendency for doubt, the underlying tendency for conceit, the underlying tendency for the desire to be reborn, and the underlying tendency for delusion. This in itself puts an end to all disputes and to the drive to resort to sticks and weapons, to taking sides, to quarreling, to fighting, to slandering, to all manners of accusations, to using vile language, and to the telling of lies. In this way, Bhikkhu, all these evil and unwholesome situations cease for such a person without leaving any remainders behind. You know, in our minds, we have certain exceptions, situations that we consider to be exceptionally unique, whereby we can leave our sila behind. Yeah, I can practice the 5 precepts up until somebody comes to me with this. Somebody says something against my mother or my country, my family, or hits me in this way, or we have exceptions in our mind. But just recalling to ourselves some of these words, the underlying tendency for lust or for hatred, eventually it leads a person to, when it's removed, it leads a person to move away from using sticks and weapons, meaning fighting, or using harsh words. Because the moment we start exchanging harsh words, a whole Pandora's box opened up. Because you have released the most powerful surge, flow, and there's no way you could stop it until it dies down. But after a major carnage, after a major chaos had taken place already. So for the most part in the world, we are encouraged to lean into, grasp, get mixed up in different types of views. Usually wrong view, by the way. And in this sutta, it's saying from this these verses, these words actually of this verse, we're seeing how in the case of a person who does not lean into, does not grasp, not get mixed up to with these wrong views, then they won't have the blindness to be sucked into this is my soul identification. This is me. In Pali is eso me atta. This is myself. This is my soul, if you will. Such a person is able to see the arising and vanishing of phenomena. Such a person is able to see suffering arise and the disappearance of suffering. And earlier I was briefly mentioning Namarupa from the aggregates and how we have the propensity of grabbing onto them. When you grab something, you're unable to see its rise and disappearance. You're identified with it. And that's why the Lord Buddha is also saying the personalization. Personalization, that's the key. That's the problem. So what we must understand. Otherwise, we are going to be lifting sticks and weapons, and we are going to be hurling insults. We are going to be saying, okay, hold my sila for a second. Hold my sila over here. I'm going to go in and get into, like, get my hands dirty. Later on, I'll retake my sila or sit and go on a retreat or something. But this is big. I have to address. You don't understand. I have to. No, you don't. Otherwise, we're going to be sucked into it. And it's very difficult to get out of. But a person who has no longer the doubt is a person who sees the arising and vanishing of these thoughts that are coming in, that are trying to invade. That's where the papañcas are doing their work. They're adding layers upon layers of details that don't exist, nuances of identification, of me versus you. Because a person who has no more any doubt is a person who has tasted the Dhamma. Okay, let's continue. And the bhikkhus reflected, now who could give us a detailed explanation for this short summary? And then it occurred to those bhikkhus, the Venerable Mahākaccāna is praised by the teacher, as well as considered wise and held in such high regard by his fellow companions in the holy life. The Venerable Mahākaccāna is capable in giving us the detailed explanation for this short summary given by the Blessed One. What if we approached the Venerable Mahākaccāna and asked him about this? Then those bhikkhus went and approached the Venerable Mahākaccāna, and after exchanging friendly greetings with him, they sat down to one side and said, Friend Mahākaccāna, the Blessed One gave us a short summary, but without giving the detailed explanation for it. And right after uttering his words, he arose from his seat and returned to his kuti. Now, this is the summary of the teaching he gave us. So, because I went over it twice, so I'm just going to skip it this time. And so, mental proliferation, though, I just want to pause here for that. Which is papañcas. First off, I highly recommend reading a book written by the late Venerable Katukurunde Nyanananda of Sri Lanka. He passed away about 3 years ago, I believe, 3.5 to 4 years ago, maybe. And he was such a brilliant monk, bhikkhu. He was both a practitioner, which is beautiful, and a scholar. He would give him anything, he would take it apart. So without disrespect to Venerable Mahākaccāna, I would say without hesitation that he would qualify with my own little understanding of the Dhamma. Venerable Nyanananda would be our modern Venerable Mahākaccāna because of his vast oceanic size knowledge of the Dhamma and the commentaries and the sub-commentaries. So he wrote extensively on papañcas. In fact, it was the major topic of his dissertation at the University, I believe, of Peradeniya in Kandy, Sri Lanka. And his professors convinced him to turn it into a book, which ended up being the book titled Concept and Reality, which is now available again in print, and it's freely available also in PDF online. So papañcas, it's the last stage of, think of it as the last stage of sense cognition. And we also have vitakka vichara. These are constituent parts of the jhanic factors, basically. Vitakka would be thinking, vitakka vichara, and vichara would be the pondering part, thinking and pondering. So sometimes some people have been confused as to what is the difference between these and papañcas. Aren't they the same thing? They're not. And because papañca is like, the image that comes to me is like playing around in a sewage, in a garbage tank. garbage container with all the nasty stuff. That's what papañcas are. Think of it. But thinking doesn't necessarily have to. Pondering doesn't necessarily have to be such a state of affairs. So where does the word come from? Papañca. So it's made up with these two words, prapañc, and it conveys the meaning of spreading out, diffusion, expansion, even exponentially multiplying itself. So if this would be, if we would use something like in physics, nuclear physics, it would be like when the explosion takes place and these neutrons are just like blowing up, or protons, they're just like spreading out, and they're exponentially increasing as they spread out, diffusing or expanding, rather, spreading out. So vichara has more of a pondering or the discursive quality to it. You're trying to weigh things. You're thinking about it, vitakka, and then vichara. You're weighing things. There's investigation also involved there. There's consideration to what was thought, which is vitakka. So papañca, on the other hand, is more of a comprehensive term, which brings into it the habitual tendencies, which Lord Buddha is talking about, the anusayas, or latent tendencies even, we can say, latent tendencies, or even upakileshas, that can come in to sully the thinking process, especially the pondering. It puts its own layers. And because it is sullied by the defilements, the anusayas, whatever papañcas we have, they are pretty dirty. Hence the image that I used. It might not be the prettiest image, of course, of a garbage can or sewage that one is playing in. There's nothing new there. It's just driven by ego, driven by defilements, a lack of understanding. There you go, avidya. Let's continue. Now, they say, we have come asking if the Venerable Mahākaccāna could please provide us with the detailed explanation for this short summary. Then the Venerable Mahākaccāna addressed the bhikkhus thus. Here we see the analogy or the simile that he uses usually. Come on. Friends, much like a man in need of heartwood, going in search of it, and coming across a standing huge tree that is full of heartwood, he ignores the heartwood, the roots and the trunk, and instead considers the branches or leaves to be its heartwood. In the same way, venerable ones, while being face to face with the teacher, you have completely ignored him and have come instead asking me for the explanation. For he is the Buddha, the Blessed One, who knows and sees. He is vision itself. He is knowledge. He is truth. He has become the Dhamma and is Brahma. He is the teacher, the one who instructs and is the clarifier of meanings. He has given us the deathless. He is the Lord of the Dhamma, the Tathagata. You must have approached the Blessed One and asked the teacher himself, for then it was the right time to ask for the detailed explanation of this summary. And as the Blessed One explains it, so should you remember and bear it in your hearts. Look at the humility. Look at the humility. Do we find teachers like that today? Who kind of forego their whatever authority they might be attributed by their students and just defer it back to their own teacher. And then here the bhikkhus say, indeed, friend Mahākaccāna, the teacher is the Buddha, the Blessed One, who knows and sees. He is vision itself. He is knowledge. He is truth. He has become the Dhamma and is Brahma. He is the teacher, the one who instructs, and is the clarifier of meanings. He has given us the deathless. He is the Lord of the Dhamma, the Tathagata. We must have approached the Blessed One and asked the teacher himself, for then it was the right time to ask for the detailed explanation of this summary. Nevertheless, the Venerable Mahākaccāna is praised by the Blessed One himself, as well as considered wise and held in such high regard by his fellow companions in the holy life. The Venerable Mahākaccāna is capable in giving us the detailed explanation for this short summary given by the Blessed One. We kindly ask that friend Mahākaccāna may not find our request troublesome, and please explain this to us. In that case, friends, listen carefully to what I shall say and pay close attention. Yes, friend, those bhikkhus replied, and the Venerable Mahākaccāna continued. In returning back to his kuti, the Blessed One, not having given you the detailed explanation to his short summary that instructs, bhikkhus, whenever harassed by the mental proliferations that are caused by getting caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, if one does not welcome them, nor delight in them, nor grasp onto them, then this means one has removed the underlying tendency for lust, the underlying tendency for hatred, the underlying tendency for holding on to wrong views, the underlying tendency for doubt, the underlying tendency for conceit, the underlying tendency for the desire to be reborn, and the underlying tendency for delusion. This in itself puts an end to all disputes and the drive to resort to sticks and weapons, to taking sides, to quarreling, to fighting, to slandering, to all manners of accusations, to using vile language, and to the telling of lies. In this way, bhikkhus, all these evil and unwholesome situations cease for such a person, without leaving any remainders behind. Now, the way I understand and explain the Blessed One's short summary here is as follows. Friends, when the eyes meet with forms, as a result, there occurs sense awareness of eyesight. And when these three come together, there is contact. In the presence of contact, feelings arise. What is felt is then perceived, and as a result, one engages in thinking. Entertaining thoughts and memories, there takes place mental proliferation. Now, whatever one thus mentally proliferates is the very source of what harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, whether from the past, future, or present, all triggered by the experience of eyesight. Here we're going to see with each sense space how Venerable Mahākaccāna applies the same pattern as he repeats it for the other senses. And what he is taking this into the arena of is that of conditionality, paccaya. So that's the theme that we're going to see playing out of the entire exposition, meaning the principle of conditionality, which we also see, obviously, in the paticcasamuppada, the principle of dependent origination or co-arising. And at the last part of this classification in the sutta, we are going to see how Venerable Mahākaccāna brings it all to a full stop in the form of it ceasing when the preceding conditions cease. So because of causality, because of this arises. But when there is the preceding part, that no more, it's no more there, then what was to come after that no longer happens, no longer comes to be, hence its cessation. So that's where the classification is going to lead us to. And then he continues, in the same way, when the ears meet with sounds, as a result, there occurs a sense awareness of hearing. And when these three come together, there is contact. In the presence of contact, feelings arise. What is felt is then perceived. And as a result, one engages in thinking, entertaining thoughts and memories. There takes place mental proliferation. Now, whatever one thus mentally proliferates is the very source of what harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, whether from the past, future, or present, all triggered by the experience of hearing. In the Untitled Sutta, which is Nikāya number 9, we see how Lord Buddha says, to be thinking at all is the inferior state. So it's much better not to be thinking. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we need to be in a sammoha or stupefaction state. That's not what is meant here. So we need to be careful not to fall into either extremes. So remember, this is the middle path, Majjhima pada, the Dhamma, Buddhism is the middle path after all. But we have, especially now, a propensity, we have this drive to constantly be thinking and pondering things and never taking a moment's rest. In the Papañcas Sutta, which is Majimanikai number 102, we read how Lord Buddha says, a perception is a disease, a boil, a dart, while the complete absence of perception is senseless stupefaction, sammoha, which I was referring to. So, because we're always at the mercy of concepts, thoughts and ideas of the world, which we later term as our understanding, my view, my opinion, my beliefs. Hence, they're called miccāditi, or wrong view. Because it doesn't just stay as my understanding, it's going to turn into my experience of the world. And if I'm starting with a wrong view, guess what? My entire understanding and my experience itself is going to end up being nothing other than absolute delusion, having nothing to do with reality. That's why we call an awakened one, because the light of wisdom is now shining for the person. They see things the way they really are. And there's no more wrong view. So we need to understand the emptiness of concepts, in the ultimate sense, the emptiness of concepts. Of course, Lord Buddha doesn't nullify, like I was mentioning in the Papañcas Sutta, Majjimanikai 102. In another sutta, Majjimanikai 60, Apannaka Sutta, the faultless sutta. Apannaka means faultless. We see how the Buddha is saying, I have a quote here. One can, therefore, without inhibition, make use of the conceptual tools at his command in his spiritual endeavors. Only he must sharpen them and continue to sharpen them until they wear themselves out in the process of using them, us using them. So it wears itself out. And the mind sees ultimately that it's just a means to an end. The concepts, I mean. So this is a deterrent for us not to go into extreme. Well, the Buddha is saying, therefore, no thinking, concepts are bad. No, as evidenced by what he said. That's not what he's saying. We need to use the conceptual tools, but not be slaves to them. So, in the same way, friends, when the nose meets with odors, as a result, there occurs sense awareness of smelling. And when these three come together, there is contact. In the presence of contact, feelings arise. What is felt is then perceived. And as a result, one engages in thinking, entertaining thoughts and memories. There takes place mental proliferation. Now, whatever one thus mentally proliferates is the very source of what harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, whether from the past, future, or present, all triggered by the experience of smelling. As I've mentioned to you in previous times, I feel like saying this. I wouldn't want you to be spending time taking notes. Take the moment, take the words. And that's why I'm going through each of these sections and not missing, especially these explanations with every one of the six senses, because you don't know when it might happen. When you relinquish your views, your opinions on what the Dhamma is or what these verses are supposed to mean, when you allow yourself that space, you're open to it, suddenly you might have that breakthrough. So please, that's why we set also, the first 30 minutes, we set to prepare the mind. So many countless beings attained even arahantship by listening to the Dhamma. So see if you can find that space within you. And of course, this is obviously being recorded and I'm going to post it later on. You can come back and take as many notes as you want from those. But now let's dedicate this to really taking it in like a sponge, a dry sponge, taking in water. Usually we look at the eyesight, the perception of eyesight, of the visual as the predominant. And of course, even scientists today say that that's how we usually take the world in. But we don't pay enough attention to what's also coming in through, let's say, the tongue via tasting, or the ears via hearing, or the nose through smelling. And these are bringing in information that lead the mind to get enthralled, excited. These are the things that are going to inevitably drag the person into the mud bath that is called papañcas. That's why we need to be exercising restraint as to what we are being exposed to with these sense doors. An interesting experiment you might do is today, moving forward, just see if your senses, let's say the nose, picks up some odor, some fragrance. See what that does to the mind. What are the feeling tones coming in because of that perception coming through the door? Or hearing a sound? Or tasting something? So, even though there's all these things going on, we rarely see what is really taking place. So the sense doors, even though they are there to familiarize us with the world that we're living in, oftentimes they also camouflage what is taking place. So see if you can actually, especially when we're thinking about, like in the last sutta, we talked about resuscitating the past. Lord Buddha says, do not resuscitate the past, nor be anxious, expecting something in the future. And a lot of times the mind is in a remorseful state of what has taken place. There's guilt, there's worry about the future, there's anxiety. Again, triggered by a sound, something we saw, something we heard, something we smelled. So these are opportunities to ponder the possibilities that eventually turn out to be papañcas, the mud bath of papañcas. And that's why when a person comes and touches us or says something and shakes us, suddenly we're startled into reality. We come out of papañca land, as it were. So back to the sutta. In the same way, friends, when the tongue meets with flavors, as a result, there occurs sense awareness of tasting. And when these three come together, there is contact. In the presence of contact, feelings arise. What is felt is then perceived, and as a result, one engages in thinking, entertaining thoughts and memories. There takes place mental proliferation. Now, whatever one thus mentally proliferates is the very source of what harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, whether from the past, future, or present, all triggered by the experience of tasting. The range of papañca correlates with the scope of the six senses. There we see the cessation of influence of the six senses. And because of that, there's no residue left. That's what I was referring to. By putting the guard there, an alert guard, and that's another reason why we have Sangvara, which is restraint, the restraint of the six senses, knowing, guarding the doors of the gates of this wonderful city called the mind. We're guarding it. And the ultimate goal for that is so that there would be the cessation of papañca. Basically, take a person who doesn't have papañca, you pretty much have an arahant. Because they, as the qualifier, if you remember earlier, nippapañca, the person who no longer has papañcas, mental proliferations taking place in the mind. They're living in the present moment, unadulterated, undiluted by anything else other than what is taking place. So, and well, if you don't have that, then what do you have? Well, you have the fool. The fool. Lord Buddha in the Panha Sutta in the Nikāya 21, he says, the fool who indulges in and delights in mental proliferation, in papañcas, is far removed from Nibbana, the incomparable freedom from bondage. But he who, having given up such conceptualizations, delights in the path to non-proliferation, nippapañca, it is he who attains to Nibbana, the incomparable freedom from bondage. So Nibbana is not the result of much thinking. It's the absence of that. But the thinking, pondering, they're necessary tools that need to wear themselves out in the process as they're providing us with a better understanding of what's taking place. And what's taking place is this personalization, which slowly loses its roots from under it. And that's how it can become eradicated. In the same way, when the body meets with tactile objects, as a result, there occurs sense awareness of touching. And when these three come together, there is contact. In the presence of contact, feelings arise. What is felt is then perceived, and as a result, one engages in thinking, entertaining thoughts and memories. There takes place mental proliferation. Now, whatever one thus mentally proliferates is the very source of what harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, whether from the past, future, or present, all triggered by the experience of touching. Okay. In the same way, when the mind meets with thoughts, As a result, there occurs sense awareness of thinking. And when these three come together, there is contact. In the presence of contact, feelings arise. What is felt is then perceived, and as a result, one engages in thinking, entertaining thoughts and memories. There takes place mental proliferation. Now, whatever one thus mentally proliferates is the very source of what harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, whether from the past, future, or present, all triggered by the experience of thinking. You know, we're always stitching with craving. You know, like sewing pieces of fabric, much like a needle and a thread, while sewing two pieces of cloth together. We're always stitching this pseudo reality of our experiences with our sannyas, with what we think that are happening, our sankharas, memories of the past, expectations of the future, projections, etc. In this analogy that I'm using of the needle and the thread and the fabric, I'm referring to the papañcas, of course. Our personalized storylines that we carry in our heads. Well, we technically carry them through our ears, our eyes, our tongue, our nose, body, mind. Now, the difference between a putujjana, an ordinary, average, unlearned being, and an arahant is that when we look at the arahant from the outside, it might look like they're also sewing, they're also stitching the fabric, and the needle might be going in through and through both pieces of fabric. But when we lean in and look at the needle, we see that the needle does not have any thread going through it. So we pull the needle out and we pull the pieces of fabric apart, and they are not connected. They're not slaves to their sannyas, to their sankharas. So an arahant goes through the process of thinking, even pondering, behaving amidst all of us in society, looking like there's nothing different. But they lack the threading, meaning the papañcas. I found this image quite lovely to describe this process, this very intricate process. And I wanted to share them with you. It was through a book I read by Dhammajīva Mahathera from Sri Lanka. He had written it somewhere. Friends, in the presence of a functioning eye, visible forms, and the sense awareness of eyesight, contact becomes possible. When contact is present thus, feelings manifest. And when there is feeling, then perception becomes possible. As a result of perception, thinking becomes possible. And when there is thinking, then it becomes possible to point out what it is that harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation. So now we're seeing the theme of the Paticcasamuppada playing much more clearly. And there's another wonderful sutta, which is much more, in a sense, regimented, without extra explanations offered in it. And what I'm referring to is the Chachaka Sutta, Majjimanikai number 148, a very, very powerful sutta. People have really gone deep in their practice just by listening to it several times. So I highly encourage you to do that. So you see elements of that in this Madhupiṇḍika Sutta as well. So the papañcas again here, which is for eso me atta, which is this is myself, that sense of identification is being referred to, given the form, given the sound, given the taste, etc., which is obscuring the true clarity of the mind while also giving rise to obsession, obsession about what we saw, obsession about what we heard, whether good or bad. It's obsession. It dominates the mind. It sullies the mind with the papañcas. And here we have when you have the papañcas, it also means that we have the anusayas, meaning they're led by the three tanha, ditthi, and mana, which are basically, tanha is craving, and ditthi is the opinions, even wrong view, of course, and mana is conceit. This trio plays along beautifully in the realm, in the world of papañcas. In fact, it animates papañcas. That's the thing which is also obscuring what's really taking place, turning the mind rather obsessed. Similarly, in the presence of a functioning ear, audible sounds, and the sense awareness of hearing, contact becomes possible. When contact is present, thus, feelings manifest. And when there is feeling, then perception becomes possible. As a result of perception, thinking becomes possible. And when there is thinking, then it becomes possible to point out what it is that harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation. Similarly, in the presence of a functioning nose, to save up time, I'm going to go ahead and just go through these different senses just by reading the first portion of the first line of each, because you understand they're referring to the six senses. So similarly, in the presence of a functioning tongue, similarly in the presence of a body, tactile objects, and then there is the sense awareness of touching. Similarly, in the presence of a cognizant mind, thoughts, and the sense awareness of thinking, contact becomes possible. When contact is present, thus, feelings manifest. And when there is feeling, then perception becomes possible. As a result of perception, thinking becomes possible. And when there is thinking, then it becomes possible to point out what it is that harasses a person, who gets caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation. In a way, we can say that thinking and feeling are both optional. That's what we're getting the image of, in a sense. Feeling in the sense that we're obsessing over something. We're holding on to the feeling. So when it is no longer just a feeling, when it is no longer just a thinking or a thought that arises and vanishes, when we have added that extra layer of personalization to them, that doesn't it's not a necessary thing. That's what the Lord Buddha is saying. But the mind is always trying to find some form of friction, some type of a relatability, tiny little jolts, and sometimes even massively shocking earthquakes of experiences that have some kind of a lasting flavor for us. They leave that mark in us. But why? So that the mind can amuse itself, to remain constantly in a state of occupation, being occupied, being fascinated with various kinds of states of mind. So it needs to chew on something, if you will. That's why so many of us feel awkward when there is stillness in the mind suddenly. When people reach the state of equanimity, upekkha, in their meditation, sometimes they're jolted. They're like, this is unusual. Something needs to be happening. Why isn't something happening? As if it's a bad thing. In fact, it's a wonderful thing. That means the ground is set now for what is to follow. But we don't go around looking for that. So this agitation of something must be taking place, how come it's not happening, makes us lose that beautiful calm, of equanimity. So, and the mind doesn't like to be bored. It will translate this state of, I just am using the equanimous state as an example here, but that quietude, that state of contentment can lead a person sometimes who's not understanding as to what is taking place behind the scenes to look at it as a state of boredom. I'm bored. That's another thing that comes up with some meditators. No, you're mistranslating it. There's wrong view. Please pull back. Just take a step back and just look where you were and look how you are now. Is there a difference? There was chaos, there was anxiety, turmoil in your mind. Now there isn't. That ain't so bad. So, but if most of the time, however, people want to distract themselves incessantly and indefinitely, and the mind ends up being like a seesaw in becoming and non-becoming, becoming and non-becoming. So there is preferential preferences, basically. And now we are in the la-la land of resuscitating the past and expecting something in the future. So we're not seeing basically the arising and the vanishing, which is a key ingredient in the understanding of a person entering into arahantship, approaching it, or an arahant. They clearly see this from what we understand in these descriptions given. So the word is upada, which is becoming in a sense, or arising, and vaya, which is the opposite of that, the non-becoming, or the weathering away, fading away. And basically understanding these two extremes is all about sammaditthi, which I was mentioning earlier, which is right view. But friends, in the absence of a functioning eye, this is where he is tying it all together. In the absence of a functioning eye, absence of visible forms, where the sense awareness of eyesight is no longer present, then contact becomes impossible, because he just eliminated the preceding cause. When contact is absent, thus, feelings do not manifest. And in the absence of feelings, perceptions do not occur. In the absence of perceptions, thinking becomes impossible. And when there is no more thinking, then it is impossible to point out anything that would harass a person who is no more caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation. Okay. Similarly, in the absence of a functioning ear, absence of audible sounds, where the sense awareness of hearing is no longer present, then contact becomes impossible. When contact is absent, thus, feelings do not manifest. And in the absence of feelings, perceptions do not occur. In the absence of perceptions, thinking becomes impossible. And when there is no more thinking, then it is impossible to point out anything that would harass a person who is no more caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation, which basically what the world is trying to have us do the opposite of. The world wants us to be very much engaged, identify, personalizing the world and all its experiences. The world wants us to mentally proliferate. The economy runs on that, today's economy, which is so convoluted, of consumerism, etc. Political systems, what's happening in the world today, all these fear-mongering, everything that's happening is all the product of mental proliferation. So let's be smart about what's happening. So we're basically detaching ourselves from papañcas. That's what these verses detailed explanation of Venerable Mahākaccāna is referring to. Detaching. From what? Well, Because there is an attachment that we have. Remember the grabbing, the Nile crocodiles, 5,000 psi bite? That grabbing prevents us from understanding things as they are. Lord Buddha calls it yata bhutang pajanati. The person understands how things come to be. But we grab. And several, I think in the beginning suttas, I think it was the second week that we were doing these series, in the Pachalayamana Sutta, the dozing off with Venerable Mahākaccāna, if you recall, when Venerable Mahākaccāna turned to Lord Buddha and asked, Bhante, is there a very succinct, very short, very brief, encapsulating teaching, very short, by following which a person can attain the ultimate security from bondage, meaning arahantship, freedom from dukkha? And the Buddha says, yes. He says, Moggallana, you must understand that nothing is fit to be clung to, grabbed onto, nothing, including our understanding of Nibbana, including Nibbana itself. Otherwise, it's just a concept. It becomes a concept. We're always latching on to something. Remember, the mind doesn't like to go from a papañca-ridden state to absence of papañca and feel okay, unless it is being prepared continuously to become acclimated to that. So the mind has to be detached from this propensity, this drive. But how? This would be a legitimately asked question here. How? How can we become detached from mental proliferations? What is the method of detaching? Would be another way of asking the question. What is the thing that gets us to disengage from self-identification? What is the method? It is by simply knowing that we are clinging, that knowing that we are grabbing, that knowing that we are carrying the raft over our head. So many times we think we know the Dhamma, we've memorized, we know, we can take it apart, we can explain so many things, but that is like carrying the raft over our head on land. We're still holding on because we're still lost in the whirlpool of papañcas. But how can we know? How can we know? The knowing that we are. But how can we know? It is by using a meditation object. It is by using a meditation object that is tried and tested and proven itself to be reliable for us. Thanks to our commitment, of course. It's not the tool that's going to make it outstanding. It is how it's being used, of course, right? But in our very rich tradition, we have so many tools. We have the breath, we have metta, we have contemplation of the body, we have contemplation of feelings, mind, we have contemplation of death. We have the qualities of the triple gem, Buddho, Dhammo, Sangho. All these are powerful, powerful tools that we can use to grab hold of ourselves, to anchor ourselves down when the papañcas come. It's like a tornado pulling us away. The knowing takes place when we are anchored safely in the object of meditation. And this is where the spotlight can be shed on what's taking place. So we're not functioning on autopilot. And that's what I would like to say, that as a way to detach ourselves from the papañcas. It is the dedication to the meditation object. Hence, sati is extremely important. Sati, your mindfulness. What's happening here in my mind right now? That's why I invite you to always be checking. That's what the guards are, the metaphorical guards around your city gates. And there's 6 of them, right? six gates, for your six senses. Always be on guard to shed the spotlight with wise attention, meaning yoniso manasikara. That's how we will reveal the magic show that's taking place before our eyes, but we don't know it. Because we think this is me, this is mine. Eso me atta. This is myself. That's how we're fooled by the sannyas, by the sankharas, and by the papañcas. Because they separate us from seeing things as they are. So, and Venerable Mahākaccāna continues, similarly, in the absence of a functioning nose, the absence of a functioning tongue, the absence of a body, and in the absence of tactile objects where the sense awareness of touching is no longer present, then contact becomes impossible. When contact is absent, thus, feelings do not manifest. And in the absence of feelings, perceptions do not occur. In the absence of perceptions, thinking becomes impossible. And when there is no more thinking, then it is impossible to point out anything that would harass a person who is no more caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation. You can think of papañcas as simply the deluded self, or ego's, even though I rarely use that term, ego's way of giving us a false sense of grounding. I mentioned so many times the need for us to ground ourselves. We seek to ground ourselves, especially in the case of trauma we've experienced. Anxiety, because we're always taken away from the reality of what's taking place. But what is that? So in a way, you can look at papañcas also the ego's way of trying to create this pseudo-reality, of trying to protect itself, protect us from the perceived threats surrounding us. Remember, even an unknown, even upekkha can be a threat. Even that calm state for an unprepared mind, that's why it's getting jolted. They want to bring something that creates friction and agitation. The mind thinks that being agitated is the normal state. Now you see what I mean by the deluded mind, by having wrong view. Because it's completely upside down, topsy-turvy. It's convoluted. So it is creating a narrative that is it's predictable. It gives us a false sense of control, basically. Papañcas are trying to give us a false sense of control by creating a narrative in a reactionary form, in a way for us to understand the world around, even though it's completely false. So the inner guidance, it's like an inner guidance system that is trying to address whatever it thinks is taking place, or we think is taking place, completely divorced from whatever is really taking place. Hence, papañcas are like a mud bath or, sewage. Now, whether this construction of pseudo-reality is good for us or not doesn't matter to the deluded mind. It is irrelevant and even seen as a waste of time. So the attitude the average mind has is that papañcas are never to be questioned. We never like to question them. We never like to challenge their authenticity. And so they remain unchallenged, unquestionably accepted. And this is, after all, where our familiar and habitual tendencies come from. While, as I mentioned earlier, tanha, which is craving, conceit, mana, and wrong view, ditthi, are always leading the show. Always. So, again, how do we do this? We must always be including sati, mindfulness. Mindfulness is not a passive affair. It's a very mighty protection mechanism. Sati is very protective, can be very protective. Sati is the one that comes in and says, hey, taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, buddy, hello, you're not on your meditation object. Come back. Stay with the breath. Stay with metta. Stay with buddho. Stay with the mind contemplation, whatever your object is. So sati, in this case, anchors us in what really matters in the present body, in the living experience, in not going anywhere other than here, staying here. And that's when we're going to see the colorations of the kileshas taking place, the defilements. So similarly, in the absence of a cognizing mind, absence of thoughts, where the sense awareness of thinking is no longer present, then contact becomes impossible. When contact is absent, thus, feelings do not manifest. And in the absence of feelings, perceptions do not occur. In the absence of perceptions, thinking becomes impossible. And when there is no more thinking, then it is impossible to point out anything that would harass a person who is no more caught up in personalizing memories of the world and its experiences, which themselves are the products of mental proliferation. So those three things, if you can recall, tanha, craving, ditthi, wrong view, opinions, and mana, conceit. Seeing those in our personal experience as it's taking place, with the help of sati, really is the way to detach ourselves from personalization, further personalization, because that's how we're going to free ourselves from the yoke that Lord Buddha talks about initially, the yoke of proliferating concepts. In order for us to relinquish the jaws of the Nile crocodile's 5,000 psi bite, because now we're going to be able to see and remove the evil states of mind that is lost in the papañca land, because now we see it's no longer there. We're no longer lost. And this also releases us not just from our internal conflicts, but also entire societies from their own conflicts, if they're able to see this. And that is the main message of the Madhupiṇḍika, in fact. So, friends, in returning back to his kuti, the Blessed One, not having given you the detailed explanation to his short summary, which he goes again with that entire short summary, this is how I understand and explain the Blessed One's short summary. Venerable Mahākaccāna says, now, friends, if you wish, please go and approach the Blessed One and ask him about this. And as the Blessed Lord explains it to you, you should listen carefully, remembering and bearing it in your hearts. Yes, friend, replied those bhikkhus, being delighted and grateful in hearing the Venerable Mahākaccāna's words, as they arose from their seats and went to the Blessed One. And after paying homage to the teacher, they sat down to one side and recounted all that had taken place, while adding, Bhante, having requested from the Venerable Mahākaccāna the meaning of the summary given to us earlier by the Blessed One, the Venerable Mahākaccāna explained it in detail, which he did in this manner, while using these words, meanings, and phrases. In hearing their words, the Blessed One replied, Mahākaccāna is wise, bhikkhus. Mahākaccāna possesses penetrating insight. If you had approached and asked me instead for the detailed explanation to this summary, I would have explained it to you in the exact same manner as did Mahākaccāna. For that indeed is its meaning, and that is how you should remember and bear it in your hearts. When this was said, the Venerable Ananda asked the Blessed One, Bhante, just like a man, being weak and starved by hunger, were to be offered a honey bowl, Whichever part of the dessert he may bite into, he would only taste its sweetness and delicious flavor. In the same manner, Bhante, whenever a competently skilled bhikkhu might carefully examine the meaning of this discourse on the Dhamma and with wisdom, he would only find satisfaction, joy, and tranquility of the heart. Bhante, what should be the name of this discourse on the Dhamma? Well, Ananda, as you put it, you may remember this discourse on the Dhamma as the honey ball discourse. This is what the Blessed One said, and the Venerable Ananda was satisfied and delighted in hearing the teacher's words. So. We see the differences in the continuously shape-shifting nature of sannyas in and by closely looking at the movement of the heart, chitta. As Ajahn Mun would say in his classic poem, Kanda Vimukti, shape-shifting nature of the sannyas. They're constantly changing, but we're never there to see the arising and the vanishing. They're never steady. They're all anicca, they're all impermanent. But just a spark is necessary to start this whole fire of personalization of me, myself, this is mine. I have to defend it tooth and nails business. Getting lost in the flowing images, the flooding of sannyas, or getting intoxicated with the unending issues constructed by the sankharas is how we're being played at the hands of the papañcas. And thus we're being caught in the quicksand of delusion. Delusion where there's no true and lasting freedom to be found. It is only when we put the energy demanding some key answers from the heart itself, which requires us to be authentic, as to why is this happening? Why am I in this mess? Being honest, demanding questions from the heart, not somebody else, that we can begin to see this trickery taking place. And when the heart stops believing the never-ending flow of perceptions, papañcas, then the eyes stop looking outward. The mind stops wasting its time judging or finding fault with others. And there is peace. There's no agitation. And the heart becomes cool when it is no longer in the clutches of the sankharas, no more lost in the whirlpool of papañcas. So I will stop here. And as you know, it is an extensive, powerful sutta, one of my favorites. Again, this was another intimidating sutta for me for many years because I couldn't understand the verses because they were so convoluted until I went in and tried to make sense of what Lord Buddha was saying. It was too abstract for me. That's not how I learn things. So I hope what I shared here today is useful to your practice and understanding of the Dhamma. And I will stop here, as I said, and open for any questions, thoughts, comments, critiques you may have. And drink some water.
Bhante, may I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a wonderful sutta, and I was wondering whether you can explain the difference between the teachings of the Dhamma and concepts. And when you mentioned that a bhikkhu has oceanic learning, it comes to my mind that how do you have oceanic learning of the Dhamma if it does not allow a certain proliferation of the Dharma in the mind. So I'm just wondering, how do we make the distinction in ordinary life to tell the difference between the two, and also the things that we need to guard away, like our five senses? They could be useful in leading us to understand the Dharma. Like you have this beautiful, painting behind you, and then it requires our eyes to see it, and I would love to touch it. So how do we kind of distinguish the so-called good concept of the Dharma from these dangerous concepts that harass our minds? Thank you.
Of course. You using the example of the painting, it's you said beautiful painting, so that shows appreciation. But then you added the line, "I would love to touch it." I would love to touch it. You leaned into it too much, the Dhamma would say. There was an appreciation. Up to that point, we were good. Everything was dandy. Everything was fine. But then there was this longing. I know you meant it, just as a form of saying it, let's say. But what we do normally in our lives, we lean too much into it. That's when we're grabbing on to the eyesight, the objects of the eyesight, the objects of the ears, hearing, etc., etc. Now, if you recall several places I mentioned in different suttas where Lord Buddha, is delineating clearly the middle path of not negating the importance of concept or concepting, if you will, thinking, pondering. He's not negating those because it is a tool, which, as he pointed out, it's a tool that the person, the practitioner, keeps on using until it wears itself out. Meaning, you use the boat to get onto the other shore to safety. Now, the image that Lord Buddha gives is the raft, the boat. What many people think is that the person needs to carry the boat over their head. Now, funnily enough, it's never recorded anywhere that, as far as I know, where a person has crossed over and carried the boat. It is only those people who are on this side of the bank of the river who are imagining and philosophizing, theorizing, in fact, that yes, once we're over there on that side, then we should carry these principles with us. Otherwise, how will the Arahant know that he's an Arahant? How will he act? How will he behave? How will he do it? So it is the deluded among us over here on this bank of the river, using papañcas, imaginings, which is manjana, imaginings. It's like somebody who's never gone to China in 400 years ago, thinking about how China is like. In Venice, before Marco Polo went, they were saying people were coming from long travels and they were claiming that they had gone to China. And they were coming up with all these ridiculous things about people having abnormal shape, more than one arm, or more than two arms or two legs. And people were so gullible, they were believing it. Imaginings, complete imaginings. Now, this is the result of just living in papañca land. Now, coming back to the first part of your question, there was, interestingly enough, there was a man, a prince, in fact, I forgot his name, who comes to Lord Buddha. I believe it's in the, if I'm not mistaken, in the numerical discourses, Nikāya. He comes to the Buddha and he says something along the lines of what you asked, meaning, how does the Arahant, how does the teacher of Dhamma, how does Lord Buddha carry all this knowledge? He must be conceptualizing after all, right? He must be carrying the Dhamma in this invisible, digital, whatever, iCloud library somewhere, right? And Lord Buddha had a knack of asking, answering a question via a question, and he turns to this the questioner, the prince, and he says, Prince, you know very well how to guide your chariot, right? And he was apparently, this prince was known for his charioteering abilities. And he says, yes, of course. And he says, and he points out the different parts of the chariot. It's a two-wheel chariot that's drawn by these two beautiful stallions, or one. Very powerful, fast-moving, swift-moving, vehicle in those days. So you needed to have perfect control of it in different ways. You have to know everything about the vehicle. So the Lord Buddha asks him about the different parts of the chariot, and the prince points them out. And he says, yes, this is for this is for that. And he says, now when you're riding the chariot, are you carrying all that knowledge in some type of a manuscript? Somebody who's repeating them to you? He says, no, of course not, he says. They're part of me. The person has reached a deep level of understanding, proficiency, expertise. The knowledge and the person have become one. Perfection. It's like an art form. I remember years ago, I was a teenager, and when I used to do Kung Fu, Wushu, and then people said, well, what does Kung Fu mean? What this person mentioned to me was, I don't know if it's complete, but it makes sense. I've asked other individuals over the years, but basically it's mastery, skillfulness to such a depth that you and the thing are one. So there isn't a concepting, a thinking of. It just flows because the person is now living within what is happening in the confines of this moment. They're not dwelling in the past. And in fact, just to use another example from martial arts, they say that if there are two people going in to fight each other, a duel or something, the person who is going to think about or is thinking about what will be his or her next move is already defeated. Why? Because they shut themselves out of reality. They're not there. They're dead, in fact. They're dead because they're living in papañcas. So that's what my understanding is vis-a-vis the usefulness of concepts. We need to have concepts, after all, that's what we're using. So we should be very careful between going into like, no, it's either this or that. No. The middle path is crucial. The middle path is crucial for our understanding, to constantly be brought into focus. Otherwise, the mind loves becoming and non-becoming. How's this working for you? I'm glad. Good. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Thank you, Bhante. I always have to I always try to even simplify more because I can't quite grasp things. Would it be fair to use the word for like today when you're talking about how the mental thoughts and the different proliferations and delusions kind of possess you? I was thinking that it would be wrong to say that I'm kind of, to use the word colonized, that I'm kind of colonized by these type of phenomena, and that, through the colonization, of course, it creates many sense of, say, false status or certain kind of delusions, but all the while I'm actually possessed, whether I realize it or not. And of course, the goal is to, once I recognize this, is to kind of liberate myself. from this kind of colonization of my body or my mind and so forth. But is that too weird a way?
Well, it definitely says a few things about the person using the word colonization. And if I were to look at the word, and I can't help but also look at the person, and which part of the world they come from, et cetera, automatically what that will give me is an image of what you might be meaning with the word usage of colonization. So immediately the mind might go, oh, colonizers, imperial European colonizing and all that stuff can play in. So I need to, at that point, really jump back into the questioner and ask, what do you mean by colonizing? Is there remnants of those images, feelings attached to it? Because that is significant. Because ultimately, what that might mean also is that the papañcas that are playing in the mind of the questioner in the usage of the word colony, colonizing, that might also be playing a part in obscuring or creating this obscuration rather of something. There's some layers of a personalization there. So I find it much more useful to use a rather more neutral word like personalizing. I use that instead of self-identification, because oftentimes many people like, what do you mean by self-identification? It's become overly used, but not enough explanation provided. But when we say, I'm personalizing it, okay, it's my person, I'm taking it under my skin, I'm seeing it as part of me. So again, though, however it works for you to give you a fullest spectrum of what the papañcas are, go ahead and use that term if it sounds good for you. But please be cognizant that there might be some old wounds of, yeah, you're giggling, that is or would be playing in the background. Remember, we're all subject, so long as we're not arahants, we're all being subject to this magic show of trickery. So the sannyas are always going to present the victim and the perpetrator story, good and bad, love and hate. It's always, when you have those feelings in you, in your mind, guess what? There's no equanimity, meaning you are in the grasp, in the death trap of the kileshas. Despite how logical, how much making sense there is in there. Like, yeah, but history says that, my ancestors, I get it. But it's still the play of the sannyas. Labels, memories, concepts, even expectations. Because what will ensue from sannyas, inevitably, is this dichotomy, good and bad, love and hate, love and hate, love and hate. Now, if you're practicing sati, if you're practicing a meditation object that brings you to a place where you can pull yourself away from it by a few millimeters even and look at it as an external happening, then you'll see the sannyas for what they are, instead of being sucked into the, in this case, let's say the colonization wounds. So that's
no, this is right.
Sorry.
No, this is helpful. No, actually, I wasn't referring to, say, white or European colonizers. I kind of meant it in the sense that, all right, one could be colonized by COVID, by one's own desire, by some other kind of mental parasites that enter. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I meant, because of course I think I'm fairly aware that if I do the black and white thing and just say, oh, well, imperialism caused everything, that's really kind of over simplistic. But what I meant by colonizers is that, we ourselves, colonize ourselves too. I mean, we we don't guard against things, and we let greed, desire, delusion enter and colonize ourself. And many times it's very seductive, so we don't really realize it until it's a little bit too late. So anyway, thank you.
Of course, yes. Yeah, in that sense, I mean, that's why a few times I've mentioned how the real virus is not COVID. Because ultimately we're going to die anyhow, right? But the real virus is the delusion, the ignorance, which I'm going to be carrying with me if I haven't cut the cord by the end of this life. Sorry. So I'm saving this body for what? For the worms later on? So I give myself another 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 60 years. Fine. What's next? I'm still going to croak and die. So that's not a virus for me. What they're talking about, what they're making such a big deal about. We're all going to die. Yeah, protect yourself. Of course. Take some measures to protect yourself. I get it. But can I approach the real virus inside, my delusion, my convincing myself of things that don't exist in reality, and not looking at the actual culprit, which is my being unmindful when these attackers are coming in through these 6 gates. And I'm completely relinquishing. I'm just like waving my hands and running away and, calling the guards and saying, fall back, we're doomed. Or it's okay, it's party time. We're not going to actually have any harm coming in from outside. All these strategies that we have, so which end up causing us suffering at the end. And it's a cyclical happening. And that is the virus as far as I'm concerned. Any other thoughts, comments? Yeah, this is a sutta that requires going back to again and again and again. It has so much to give. It's a wonderful sutta discourse.
Thanks very much, Bhante, for the talk. From my understanding of this sutta, it is definitely not about not seeing, not hearing, not tasting, not smelling, not touching, not thinking, so as not to allow papañcas to happen, but rather to use the 6 senses wisely, to not get caught into unnecessary thoughts, because it actually reminds me of the very last sutta in the Majjhima which is 152, I think it's called Indriya Bhavana Sutta, whereby I think a lay, an external sect's pupil comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha asks him, how does your master teach the development of the sense faculties? And he says, it's when the eyes do not see and the ears do not hear. And the Buddha says, look, if that's the case, then a blind man and a deaf man would become arahants. So it's I guess it's it's a balance between the 2 extremes of sensual indulgence and self-mortification, as being mentioned in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm glad you, if you weren't going to use that sutta, I was going to. You jumped ahead and you used it. I'm glad you did. That sectarian person who comes and asks the Buddha, what's the technique, And the Buddha says, what does your teacher teach? And he said, like you pointed out, you know, not hearing, not seeing. I was like, okay, so a person who doesn't have those senses, then it means they're awakened. And the person actually sits there glum. And the Buddha has, you know, I guess he has some fun with him later on. And I think he turns to Venerable Ananda and says, can you believe this guy, this person's teacher? This is what he teaches. And then Lord Buddha explains, of course, what the proper teaching is. And as you were mentioning, and as I mentioned several times today, about the Majjhima Pada, the middle path. Sometimes people even have a misconception about the middle path. I've had individuals, I think I mentioned them once here, where they said, well, it's middle. So instead of drinking 10 bottles of beer, you can drink 3 or 4. So that's okay, right? That's your, that's your teacher. No. That's completely misconstruing the teaching, misrepresenting the Dhamma. Middle path means using the 6 senses, but understanding the differences when we are leaning into it, like you mentioned, how I would love to touch it, the painting, versus acknowledging it, calling it pretty initially, because your eyes caught it, you saw it, you responded to it, and there's nothing wrong with responding. Now, as we go deeper in the practice, we need to learn how to understand and appreciate seclusion, secluding ourselves from the senses. And what I mean by that is the second part of what you mentioned, meaning the leaning into it part. I would love to touch that because it looks interesting. I want to reach over. That is where the precautionary note comes in. The seclusion. Like last time we were talking about the Bhante, the ideal lover of solitude. What is the solitude that we were talking about? It's not necessarily physically, because there's a lot of people who are secluding themselves in different settings, maybe even in a cave, in a monastery, in a temple, in a room, whatever the case may be. But they might have in their hearts all kinds of deluded thinking, feelings, attachments, longings. Not every person, for example, who wears robes is completely secluded. Not every person who's a layperson is not. So we need to be secluded from our 6 senses. And that's where the guarding comes in. The guard doesn't just stop anyone and turn them away. The guard is there to protect the palace, to protect the city. From what? From any harmful, malevolent presences, any threats. That's what the 6 senses need to be restrained by. And that's what I understand as seclusion. Because too much of our life energy is being depleted, leaking out, asavas, they're called, contaminants, into and through the 6 sense doors. And they don't have to be, because there's no way of fulfilling them. Despite all your efforts to look at a beautiful thing, you will never ever truly be satisfied. Despite how often you like to listen to, let's say, a beautiful piece of music that you consider to be beautiful, you're going to still go ahead and listen to it. Want more, want more. It's like that empty barrel that you keep filling up. Empty because the bottom part is not there. There isn't a lid on the other end. So whatever we put in there, it goes straight through it without putting even a dent, slightest dent. So let us not fall into the extreme position, which immediately means that we are not practicing samadhi, which is right view. The moment we go into extremes, like, oh, the Buddha's saying so we shouldn't experience any of the senses, we should close our eyes, our ears. No, no, no. That's not what the Buddha's saying. But we're not slaves to them either. So thank you for that, Patisa, and for bringing that up. And I hope that was helpful also, what I offered.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts, comments, questions before we close? Okay. So let's share some merits. May suffering ones be suffering free and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief and may all beings find health relief. May all beings share in these merits that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of wholesome happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share in these merits of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May the Triple Gem bless you all. And for all those of you traveling, whether short or long distances, may you arrive to your destinations with safety, comfort, and at peace. Be well, and I see you next week. Take care.